Some treasures gleam not with light, but with ruin. It begins with a jewel said to carry a curse, the Las Vegas diamond, vanished from a locked case under guard, leaving only whispers of betrayal and the shadow of blood. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us walk together into the labyrinth Holmes unraveled, where desire burns brighter than any stone, and the truth cuts deeper still. It was one of those evenings when the fog of London lay heavy upon the city, rolling in thick folds down from the river, and pressing against the gas-lit streets like a living presence. The lamps along Baker Street glowed dimly through the veil, their halos no more than faint circles of light suspended in shadow. Within the familiar rooms of 221B, however, all was calm. A fire burned low in the grate, and Sherlock Holmes, with his long, sinewy frame stretched across the armchair, gazed into the embers with the abstraction that bespoke some inner train of thought. For myself, I had found a rare moment of peace in my medical journals, yet my mind wandered inevitably toward my companion. The silence of the room was broken only by the ticking of the clock upon the mantel and the occasional rustle of paper as I turned a page. There was a peculiar stillness in the air, as though London itself held its breath, waiting for some event yet to unfold. I had long since learned that such silences rarely endured for long in Holmes's company. It was in such lulls, like the stillness before a storm, that fate seemed invariably to thrust some dark and curious adventure into our lives. The sudden clatter of wheels outside was followed by a sharp rapping at our door. Mrs. Hudson's muffled protest echoed faintly before footsteps hurried upon the stair. A moment later, the door was thrust open, and there entered a man whose appearance at once banished the quietude of our sitting room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, though his bearing was that of one who had been suddenly stricken by calamity. His face, florid and accustomed to command, was pale with agitation, and his hands trembled as he clutched the brim of his hat. His accent betrayed his origins before ever he spoke. An American, and one evidently of considerable means. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he cried, his voice breaking under the strain of suppressed emotion. "I beg you, your help, sir. My household is undone. A theft most impossible has befallen us, and if it is not resolved, I fear scandal and ruin beyond repair." Holmes regarded the man with that cool, piercing gaze, which seemed to strip all subterfuge from a soul. Without rising, he motioned our visitor to the chair opposite. "Compose yourself, sir," said Holmes, in his deliberate tones. "State your case plainly. The more unusual the circumstances, the more they commend themselves to my attention." The man sank into the chair, still shaking, his eyes darting anxiously toward the window as though some unseen pursuer might be at his heels. "My name is Josiah Harcourt," he began, steadying his breath. "I am a man of industry in America, and the father of Eleanor Harcourt. Perhaps you have seen her name in society pages. She is betrothed to Henry Langley, the son of a respected family in London. As a symbol of that union, I bestowed upon her a jewel, an heirloom beyond price, known as the Las Vegas diamond." At the mention of the name, Holmes's eyes narrowed, and I could not suppress a start. For even in London, whispers of that accursed stone had reached our ears. A diamond of great size and incomparable brilliance, yet one said to bring ruin upon all who possessed it. Harcourt leaned forward, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "It vanished, gentlemen. Vanished from a safe locked by my own hand, in a chamber guarded by two of my most trusted men. The velvet case was found within, but empty. The locks unbroken. The guards swear no man entered, yet the diamond is gone." I confess I felt a shiver run through me at this account, for it seemed to defy all reason. Was it not the very definition of the impossible? Holmes, however, betrayed neither astonishment nor disbelief. He stretched out his long arm, took the empty case from Harcourt's grasp, and examined it minutely beneath the lamplight. For a time, he said nothing. The fire crackled, the fog pressed closer against the panes, and Harcourt wrung his hands in silent torment. At length Holmes spoke, very softly, almost to himself. "This diamond has not been stolen at all, Watson," he murmured, his eyes fixed upon the lining of the case. "It has been moved." Holmes took the velvet case from Harcourt's trembling hands with the same reverence a surgeon gives to a fragile specimen. He did not at once open it, but turned it slowly, inspecting the stitching, the worn corners, and the faint impressions left upon its surface. I watched his long, delicate fingers trace the lining with the patience of a man unravelling some sacred text. His hawk-like profile caught the glow of the firelight, every line of his features sharpened with intense concentration. The silence grew oppressive. Harcourt shifted uneasily in his chair, his breath quickening, while I found myself caught between anticipation and dread. It seemed inconceivable that Holmes should find aught where all else had failed, yet I had witnessed too many of his triumphs to underestimate him. He drew forth a magnifying lens from his pocket and bent over the case. For several minutes he said nothing, but his eyes gleamed with an inward light as he studied the faintest specks of dust clinging to the fabric. At last, with a sudden flick of the wrist, he closed the case and laid it gently upon the table. "Well, Watson," he said, with that familiar half-smile which was both a challenge and an invitation. "I confess myself at a loss," I replied candidly. "The case is intact, the locks unbroken, the chamber guarded. If the diamond is not within, then it must have been spirited away by means beyond human explanation." A low chuckle escaped Holmes's lips, though his eyes remained coldly intent. "Beyond human explanation? Nay, my dear fellow, nothing is more misleading than the obvious impossibility." He leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin, and for a moment it seemed as though he had fallen into one of his trances. Harcourt, bewildered, leaned forward. "Mr. Holmes, I beg you, tell me, what do you see?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the fog-laden window, as though his thoughts had already strayed far beyond the confines of our sitting room. The silence pressed upon us once more, heavy as the London fog, until I could scarce restrain myself from demanding his conclusion. Yet I knew from long acquaintance that Holmes would reveal his mind only when the pieces were fully assembled. It was Harcourt who broke the stillness, his voice raw with desperation. "Gentlemen, you do not understand. That stone is not merely a bauble. It is the foundation of my daughter's marriage, of her future. Without it, society will sneer, rivals will descend like wolves, and she will be ruined. If there is any curse in the diamond, it lies in the destruction it brings to my family's honour." Holmes stirred at last. He rose to his feet and stood by the window, where the fog pressed thickly against the glass, blurring the outlines of the street lamps beyond. His silhouette was tall and spectral, as though he were a figure carved from the very shadows themselves. For a long moment he remained thus, motionless, his head inclined in thought. Then, turning abruptly, he spoke, not to Harcourt, but to me. His voice was low, almost a whisper, yet it carried with it the quiet authority of conviction. "This diamond has not been stolen at all, Watson," said he. "It has been moved." The words struck me like the tolling of a great bell. Moved. The very suggestion seemed absurd. I stared at him in disbelief, while Harcourt uttered a strangled cry. "What do you mean, sir?" The American gasped, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "If it is not stolen, then where is it? How can a diamond vanish without theft?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with a strange light as he closed the case and returned it to Harcourt. "That, Mr. Harcourt, is the question which shall lead us to the truth. For where a stone has been moved, there is always a hand that moved it, and a reason most compelling." He sank once more into his chair, drawing long upon his pipe. The smoke curled upward in ghostly tendrils, mingling with the fog beyond, until the very air seemed charged with mystery. I could not suppress a shudder, for though his words were few, I knew with certainty that this case would lead us far from the quiet of Baker Street, into realms of danger, deception, and human frailty more perilous than any phantom curse. The journey which, conveyed us across the Atlantic seemed but a fleeting prelude to the world upon which we now entered. When at last we stepped from the carriage and gazed upon Las Vegas, I confess I was struck dumb by its strangeness. Here was a city unlike any other I had encountered, a place where night glittered like day, where towers of light rose against the darkness, and where every corner seemed to pulse with restless energy. And yet, beneath this brilliance, I felt a current of menace. The lights dazzled, but they blinded too. Behind every shimmer of colour, a shadow seemed to lurk. Men and women moved with hurried steps, their faces flushed with greed, their eyes darting like gamblers around a table whose stakes were life itself. Beside me, Holmes appeared indifferent to the spectacle. His sharp gaze passed over the gaudy splendour, as though it were but a painted mask concealing deeper truths. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "Here illusion is the very fabric of the city. It is most fitting that a jewel should vanish here, where deception is the common currency." We were ushered that evening into the Harcourt residence, a mansion set apart from the city's clamour, yet not immune to its corrupting glow. There, within a richly appointed drawing room, the principal figures of this dark drama assembled before us. First was Henry Langley, the groom-to-be, a young man of nervous bearing, his hands betraying a tremor he could not master. He greeted us with words of courtesy, yet his eyes avoided Holmes, as though already weighed down by secrets. Beside him stood Leonard Graves, the rival suitor, a figure of striking presence, whose calm composure and sardonic smile spoke of a man accustomed to bending fortune to his will. There was charm in his manner, but it was of the sort which conceals steel beneath silk. The stage magician, Armand Duval, was of a different breed altogether, cloaked in flamboyant attire, with fingers that twitched as if rehearsing invisible tricks. He seemed a creature born of smoke and mirrors. I found myself uneasy in his company, as though any moment he might pluck the very truth from one's pocket and make it disappear. Lastly, there was Charles Redmond, Harcourt's business partner. His face, lined with bitterness, carried the weight of old grudges and wounded pride. His eyes followed every word with the watchfulness of a man who has been wronged and waits only for an opportunity to strike. As I observed this strange company, I felt a sense of being drawn into some theatre of masks, each player concealing their true purpose. Holmes, however, seemed unmoved. He spoke little, his keen eyes resting upon each in turn, as though weighing their souls in silence. It was during this uneasy gathering that a sudden commotion arose. A gambler of disreputable aspect forced his way into the chamber, declaring with brazen certainty that he had seen the Las Vegas diamond displayed in a pawnbroker's window that very afternoon. Harcourt leapt to his feet with a cry, his voice hoarse with both hope and terror. "Where? Where, man? Lead us there at once." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, a subtle flicker of his eyebrow, which told me he already harboured doubt. Yet he rose without protest, and together we accompanied the gambler through twisting streets until we reached a dimly lit shop of sordid character. There, behind glass, lay a stone of extraordinary brilliance. For a moment, even I was deceived. Its facets caught the lamplight with such fire that Harcourt uttered a sob, pressing his hands against the pane as though salvation lay within his grasp. Holmes, however, bent close. He called for the jeweller, asked a few pointed questions, and then, with the gentlest of smiles, turned to us. "A clever counterfeit," he pronounced. "The workmanship is admirable, but the deception is plain enough to the trained eye. The Las Vegas diamond is not here." The jeweller blustered and protested innocence, but Holmes silenced him with a glance. Harcourt staggered back as though struck, while the gambler who had led us here vanished into the night with suspicious haste. I could not suppress a chill. What cruel hand would plant such an illusion, mocking the hopes of a desperate father? The case, which already seemed a labyrinth, grew darker still with every step we took. Holmes alone seemed unshaken. "We are being played upon, Watson," he said, his voice low. "And like a game of cards, The more tricks one perceives, the closer one draws to the hand that deals them. That evening, the household grew restless. We dined in uneasy company, each guest cloaked in civility. Yet beneath the surface, I sensed a current of hostility as sharp as any blade. The groom-to-be, Langley, excused himself often, his manner that of a man tormented by debts he dared not confess. Graves, the rival, watched him with a smile that concealed contempt, his every gesture calculated to provoke unease. The illusionist, Duval, entertained with sleight of hand at the table, producing coins from empty palms and vanishing them into air. Laughter rippled uneasily, but to me the tricks bore a sinister edge, as though each act mocked the very disappearance of the diamond. Holmes, for his part, remained quiet, his keen eyes flitting from one to another, marking every glance, every tremor of hand, every subtle exchange. It was a silence more terrible than speech. I had seen him thus before, patient, hawk-like, absorbing 1,000 small details invisible to ordinary men. I too began to note peculiarities. The business partner, Edmund, avoided the daughter's gaze, though when he thought himself unobserved, his eyes lingered upon her with a bitterness born not only of finance, but of some deeper, unspoken betrayal. The daughter herself seemed frail, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes shining with unshed tears. It was as though each soul in that house carried a secret, and the walls themselves seemed to groan with the weight of it. I could not shake the feeling of menace creeping through those corridors, as though we dined not in a house of men, but in a theatre where tragedy prepared to reveal its mask. Holmes rose suddenly, excusing himself without explanation. He passed into the shadowed hall, leaving the rest of us to our uneasy discourse. When he returned, his expression betrayed nothing, but I knew from the spark in his eye that some piece of the puzzle had already slipped into place. It was past midnight when the calm was torn asunder. I had just extinguished my lamp and was preparing for rest when a cry, shrill and terrible, rang through the mansion. I sprang up, my heart pounding, and rushed into the corridor. Holmes was already there, lantern in hand, his face pale but composed. Together we followed the sound to the servants' wing. There, in a narrow passage lit by trembling hands, the household gathered in horror. Upon the floor lay one of the guards, his body twisted unnaturally, his face frozen in a grimace of fear. Pinned to his chest, driven deep with cruel precision, was a single playing card, the ace of spades. Gasps broke from the onlookers, and the daughter cried out, nearly swooning as her father caught her in his arms. The others stared in mute terror, each face reflecting suspicion and dread. Holmes bent over the corpse, his long fingers brushing aside the fabric to study the card's placement. He neither flinched nor spoke, but his eyes gleamed with cold intensity. When at last he straightened, he cast a glance at me, and in that moment I read in his expression what words had not yet revealed. The game had turned from theft to murder. The diamond was no longer the sole prize in this sinister contest. Blood had been spilled, and with it, the shadow of death now hung over us all. The chamber into which we were led was small and dim, its single lamp throwing long, quivering shadows upon the walls. Upon the floor lay the lifeless form of the guard, his features locked in the rictus of a final, silent cry. The blood had already ceased to flow, leaving his skin ashen, his limbs rigid in death's cruel embrace. Yet it was not the body itself that transfixed all eyes, but the ghastly emblem upon his chest. There, driven through cloth and flesh alike, was a playing card, the ace of spades, its white surface stained at the edges with a darkening blot of red. In the flicker of the lamp, the symbol seemed less a token of chance and more a declaration of judgment, cold and deliberate. The daughter stifled a sob, burying her face against her father's shoulder, while Edmund muttered an oath and crossed himself. The magician's eyes glimmered strangely in the half-light, as though he beheld not tragedy, but theatre. Graves stood rigid, his expression unreadable. though his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Holmes, calm as ever, knelt beside the body. His long, deft fingers moved over the corpse, with the precision of a surgeon. He touched the card but did not remove it, tracing its edges with a cold scrutiny. Then, shifting his attention, he examined the dead man's hands, the angle of his head, the dust upon his boots. Every detail, however slight, seemed to hold meaning for him, though to me it was but a grotesque puzzle without coherence. I felt a chill run through me as I stood there, the oppressive air thick with dread. In all our adventures, few sights had struck me with such a sense of deliberate malice. It was not the wild stroke of a desperate man, but the careful, symbolic act of one who wished his crime to be remembered. Holmes rose at last, his eyes gleaming like cold steel in the lamplight. He said nothing, but I read in his countenance that he had already discerned some truth hidden from all others in that dreadful room. The household pressed upon him with clamorous voices. "Is it a warning?" cried Harcourt hoarsely. "A curse," whispered the daughter, her lips trembling. Redmond declared it the act of a cowardly assassin, while Graves muttered darkly of rivalries and vengeance. Holmes raised his hand, and the tumult fell away as though quelled by an unseen hand of authority. "Gentlemen," he said at length, his voice low but cutting through the silence, "this is no curse, nor is it a warning in the sense you suppose. The card is not the language of the supernatural, but of men who play games where the stakes are measured in blood." A murmur swept through the room. "You mean, then," I asked, "that this symbol is deliberate? A message?" "Precisely so, Watson," Holmes replied. He fixed his gaze upon the company, his eyes sweeping across each pale and guilty countenance. "The card was chosen with care. It speaks not of random cruelty, but of calculation. Whoever placed it here wished to direct our attention, to hint, perhaps, at the nature of his artifice, or to cloak it with misdirection." The magician gave a hollow laugh. "A flourish, then? Theatricality in murder? It is a trick I might have devised myself." Holmes's glance cut to him with icy sharpness. "Indeed, Mr. Duval, your profession affords you too ready an acquaintance with deception. But beware, it is a dangerous jest to liken oneself to the author of this crime." The daughter's pale lips moved in a whisper. "The diamond, it is cursed. Blood follows it, as surely as night follows day." Holmes turned to her, his expression softened but grave. "No, madam, it is not the stone that casts this shadow, but human greed, festering like a poison in the heart. The diamond is but a mirror, reflecting the darkness of those who covet it." I felt a cold weight settle upon the company. Each face seemed to bear some hidden guilt, some secret shame. Yet none dared speak, for the knowledge of death lay heavy upon us all. Holmes's eyes, meanwhile, returned once more to the lifeless guard. His hand moved with sudden purpose, and I saw him lift something small, almost imperceptible, from the stiffened fingers. He concealed it swiftly within his palm before rising to his full height. He said nothing of his discovery. Instead, he turned toward the door, his profile dark against the lamplight, and in that silence I knew with certainty. Holmes had found a clue, a fragment of truth, but one he would not yet share. The grim discovery had cast a pall over the household, and the air grew thick with suspicion. In that charged atmosphere, voices rose, trembling not with grief, but with fear and anger. Redmond, the business partner, was first to break the uneasy silence. "This is the work of Langley," he thundered, pointing a quivering finger at the groom-to-be. "His debts are known to all. He would spill blood to conceal his ruin." Langley leapt to his feet, his face ashen yet defiant. "You dare accuse me? It is you who have cause, Redmond. You who stand to gain from Harcourt's downfall. You would see him broken and his fortune scattered." The rival suitor, Graves, laughed coldly. "You are both fools. The card is no random token. It is a mark of vengeance. And vengeance," he said with a chilling calm, "is not the province of honest men, but of those who cloak themselves in business dealings and betrayals. Tempers flared, words flew like daggers, and the room became a theatre of accusation. I could scarce restrain my own alarm at the venom that poured forth, each man seeking to deflect suspicion by casting it upon another. The daughter wept openly, her fragile frame trembling under the strain, while Harcourt groaned like a man crushed beneath invisible weight. Through it all, Holmes stood apart, silent as a statue, his gaze cool and penetrating. He did not intervene, nor did he allow the chaos to disturb him. His eyes flickered from one face to another, noting every faltering word, every glance that betrayed more than it intended. Where we saw only noise and discord, he gathered truth from the tremors of fear and the sparks of anger. At length, he raised a hand, and the storm of voices dwindled into uneasy silence. Yet he spoke not a word. Instead, he turned his eyes upon the daughter, whose tears glistened in the lamplight, and in that moment a new thread of the mystery began to unravel. She sat pale and trembling, her hands clasped tightly as though in prayer. When Holmes' gaze fixed upon her, she shuddered and lowered her eyes. For a long moment she seemed incapable of speech, but at last her lips moved, the words scarcely more than a whisper. "You do not understand. None of you understand. The diamond is cursed. It has always been cursed. Wherever it has gone, blood has followed." A chill ran through me at the solemnity of her tone. In the flickering light of that dreadful chamber, her words carried a weight that seemed to summon shadows from the past. "My mother told me of it," she continued. "Long ago, in Nevada, the stone passed, from gambler to gambler. Men who possessed it were ruined. One was shot in a duel, another found dead at his own table, and yet another vanished without trace in the desert. And now," her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. A murmur passed among the company. Redmond scoffed loudly, though his voice trembled. "Superstition, a tale for children." But I confess, as I looked upon the corpse with its grotesque token, and as the girl's words echoed in my ears, I felt a creeping dread that logic could not dispel. The very air seemed heavy with foreboding, as though some ancient curse indeed clung to the jewel. Holmes, however, remained unmoved. He leaned forward, his tone sharp yet calm. "No, Miss Harcourt. Diamonds are not cursed. They are but stones, hardened carbon, born in fire, cut by man's hand. The evil you speak of lies not in the jewel, but in the hearts of those who covet it. Remember that." Her sobs quieted under his words, but the pall of dread remained, and in that moment I realized the mystery before us was no longer one of theft alone, nor even of murder. It had become a contest between illusion and truth, between superstition and Holmes's unyielding reason. As the others withdrew in restless murmurs, Holmes once more knelt beside the body. His movements were precise, almost reverent, as he studied the guard's rigid hand. To my astonishment, he prized apart the stiffened fingers and withdrew a small fragment of paper, crumpled and stained. I leaned closer, eager to glimpse its contents, but Holmes slipped it swiftly into his pocket before I could discern so much as a word. His face revealed nothing, yet I knew at once that this clue, whatever it was, bore weight upon the mystery, greater than all the clamour of accusations we had heard. "Holmes," I whispered urgently, "what have you found?" He rose to his full height, his expression cool and inscrutable. "Patience, Watson. The time for revelation has not yet arrived." I was struck dumb by his reserve, torn between admiration for his method and frustration at being kept in the dark. Yet I knew his ways too well to press him further. The clue would be unveiled when its moment had come, no sooner, no later. Holmes cast a final glance over the body, then turned toward the door. The lamplight caught the hard lines of his face, and in that instant he seemed less man than instrument, an embodiment of reason cutting through shadow, unmoved by grief or superstition. As I followed him into the dim corridor, I could not shake the image of that hidden scrap, locked within his keeping like a secret flame. Whatever truth it contained, it would shape the course of all that followed. And in that silent knowledge, the chapter closed, not with resolution, but with a question that loomed heavier than ever in the gloom. Morning broke heavy and oppressive, though the bright desert sun streamed through the curtains of the Harcourt residence with merciless brilliance. Within, however, the atmosphere remained steeped in gloom. Holmes had vanished early, and when he returned, it was with a leather-bound ledger in hand, a book of accounts belonging to young Langley, the groom-to-be. Holmes laid it upon the table before us with deliberate gravity. "Observe, Watson," he said as he turned the pages. Columns of figures marched across the paper, punctuated by scrawled notes and desperate borrowings. Here is the true character of a man soon to wed into wealth, a fortune hunter, crushed beneath debts of his own making. Langley, summoned to face this exposure, trembled visibly. His protestations fell from his lips in a torrent, pleas that he had meant to repay, that the marriage would restore his honour, that love had nothing to do with it. Yet the figures spoke louder than his words. "I never stole the diamond," he cried. "I may be a ruined man, but I am not a murderer." Holmes regarded him coolly, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "No, Mr. Langley, but you had motive enough to covet what you could not afford, and desperation sharpens many a dull blade." The groom sank into a chair, pale as death. To me, it seemed his guilt was clear. Yet, Holmes's gaze drifted elsewhere, as though Langley's sins were but one thread in a far larger tapestry. That evening we gathered once more in the drawing-room, the company tense and subdued. It was Duval, the illusionist, who broke the silence with an offer, to entertain us with a demonstration of his art, as though to prove his innocence by means of his craft. With nimble fingers, he produced a silver coin, let it dance across his knuckles, and then, before our very eyes, caused it to vanish into the ether. A gasp ran through the company as the coin reappeared moments later in Harcourt's pocket, though no man had seen the manner of its passage. To me, the effect was uncanny, and in that moment the impossible theft of the diamond no longer seemed beyond imagining. I turned to Holmes in astonishment, only to find his lips curved in the faintest trace of disdain. "A child's trick," Holmes murmured softly. "An object is concealed, attention diverted, the audience misled. It is not the act of disappearance that is difficult, Watson, but the art of misdirection. And misdirection, gentlemen," here his gaze swept across the room, "is precisely what has blinded us all in this affair." Duval flushed at the cool dismissal, though he bowed with exaggerated courtesy. "You wound me, sir. Yet perhaps you are right. The world itself is but a stage, and we, poor actors, play our parts." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Indeed, Mr. Duval, but some roles end in applause, and others in the gallows." A shiver passed through me at the quiet menace in his tone. Later, Holmes turned his attention to Charles Redmond, the business partner whose countenance seemed carved from resentment itself. They conversed in the library, while I observed in silence from a corner. Redmond spoke with bitterness of past ventures, of promises broken and opportunities lost. "Harcourt rose while I remained chained," he said, his voice low and trembling. "That diamond was not merely a jewel, it was proof of his triumph, a symbol of my failure. Is it so strange that I resent him for it?" Holmes listened with impassive face, his keen eyes never wavering. "Resentment is not guilt, Mr. Redmond," he said softly. "But envy, left to fester, has often driven men to deeds darker than theft." Redmond's lips curled. "You think me a thief, a killer?" Holmes rose, towering above him. "I think you a man consumed, sir, and a man so consumed is capable of much." Redmond's fists clenched, yet he said no more. As we departed, I could not help but feel the weight of his bitterness, like a storm cloud waiting only for lightning to ignite it. Holmes, however, seemed curiously unmoved. His thoughts, I knew, were already spinning in directions we could not yet perceive. The household was summoned at twilight to a darkened chamber where, At the urging of certain impressionable minds, a séance had been arranged. The room was draped in heavy curtains. The lamps dimmed until the only glow came from the wavering flame of a single candle set upon the table's centre. Its flicker danced over pale faces, carving shadows deep into every line of fear. Duval, the illusionist, presided over the proceedings with theatrical solemnity. His voice dropped to a whisper as he invoked unseen forces, his long fingers hovering over the flame. The daughter clutched her father's arm, her eyes wide with dread. Langley sat rigid, perspiration upon his brow. Redmond muttered a curse beneath his breath, though even he could not conceal the tremor in his hands. Suddenly, the flame flared violently, though no breeze stirred. The daughter gasped and nearly swooned, while the rest recoiled in startled silence. At that moment, a hollow sound, like the groan of a distant voice, rose from the darkness. "Blood for the diamond," it seemed to whisper. "Blood again." A cry escaped the girl's lips. Even my own heart leapt at the uncanny sound, though my reason rebelled against such trickery. All eyes turned to Holmes, who sat unmoving, his face lit coldly by the candle's flame. When the murmurs of terror had reached their height, he rose with abrupt precision, snuffed the candle with a swift gesture, and spoke into the darkness. "Enough!" His voice rang sharp as steel. "This is no spirit, but the work of human artifice, tricks of sound, diversions of light. Nothing more. The curse you fear is but another mask, designed to distract you from the hand that kills in flesh and blood." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the faint rustle of curtains. Duval attempted a nervous laugh, but it died upon his lips beneath Holmes's piercing gaze. "You see, Watson," Holmes said as he relit the lamp, "illusions may deceive the senses, but never the mind which refuses to surrender to fear. It is misdirection once again, and somewhere in this house lies the conjurer of death." The company dispersed with uneasy whispers, yet Holmes did not return to his room. Instead, he beckoned me to follow him into the dim corridor. His step was noiseless, his demeanour grave. At last, he halted before the daughter's chamber and requested a private audience. She appeared pale and weary, her eyes rimmed with tears. At the sight of Holmes, she faltered, as though sensing the weight of his scrutiny. He closed the door softly behind him and regarded her with a calm that was more terrible than anger. "Miss Harcourt," he said quietly, "you have concealed much. I must ask you plainly, why did you lie about the last time you saw the diamond?" Her breath caught in her throat, and her hands clutched the folds of her dress. I do not understand," she stammered. Holmes advanced a step, his eyes fixed upon her with unrelenting force. "I assure you, madam, equivocation is useless. You told us the diamond was last seen upon your dressing table. Yet there are marks upon the velvet case. Marks which speak of movement at another time, in another place. The truth is not where you would have us believe." Her lips quivered, her composure wavering under his relentless gaze. For an instant I thought she might confess, but she sank into her chair, covering her face with trembling hands. Holmes did not press her further. Instead, he turned to me with a look I had come to know too well, the look of a hunter who has cornered his prey but waits for the precise moment to strike. "We are close, Watson," he murmured as we departed, leaving the girl trembling in silence. "The mask begins to slip, and when it falls, the truth will be revealed. But mark me well, the danger grows with every hour we delay." The company was summoned at Holmes's command to the grand chamber of the Harcourt residence. It was a room lined with heavy draperies and portraits whose painted eyes seemed to brood over us in silence. A storm had gathered outside, its distant rumble lending a sombre percussion to the dreadful drama about to unfold. One by one, they took their seats. Langley, the groom, pale and hollow-eyed. Redmond, the embittered partner, his jaw clenched in defiance. Duval, the illusionist, with a smile too smooth to be sincere, and Graves, the rival suitor, watchful and composed. At the centre sat Eleanor Harcourt, her trembling hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed upon the carpet, as though to avoid the eyes that surrounded her. Harcourt himself stood apart, his great figure bent with anguish, his face drawn into the lines of a man who bore both grief and shame. And there at the head of the table, calm and implacable, stood Sherlock Holmes. For a long moment he spoke not a word. The hush was oppressive. Each breath seemed to echo in the stillness. Then Holmes's voice rang out, deliberate and cold, like a judge pronouncing the hour of trial. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "the time for pretense is over. We sit no longer in the theatre of deception, but in the chamber of truth. The thief, the deceiver, and the killer stands among us, and tonight their mask shall be torn away." Holmes began, as ever, with precision. He turned first to Langley, whose debts had already been laid bare. Mr. Langley sought fortune through marriage, not through murder. His accounts reveal desperation, but his hands bear no trace of the cunning required for this elaborate illusion. He is guilty of folly, but not of theft. Langley sank lower in his chair, relief mingling with shame. Holmes then addressed Redmond, whose bitterness had been laid plain in every glance. "You, sir, have nursed grievances deep and long. You would have rejoiced in Harcourt's downfall, but resentment leaves its mark, and your actions, though spiteful, were confined to words. You are no conjurer, no architect of this intricate deceit." Redmond muttered under his breath. Yet the weight of Holmes's certainty left him silent. "And as for you, Mr. Duval," Holmes said, turning sharply toward the illusionist, "you possess the skill to vanish jewels before a crowd of watchful eyes. Indeed, you lent that skill to the crime, but only as an accomplice. The true mastermind sought your art to conceal her hand. You are a trickster, not the hand that struck down the guard." A murmur rippled through the company, and all eyes turned to Eleanor Harcourt. She flinched as though struck, yet Holmes's gaze remained steady, fixed upon her like a blade poised above its mark. Holmes's voice softened, though its edge did not dull. "Miss Harcourt, from the beginning, it was you. The story of the curse was a shield, your tears a mask. You told us the diamond had been stolen, yet the velvet case itself betrayed you. It bore the faintest impressions, revealing that the stone had never left its confines, only concealed within, in a compartment hidden from all but the most exacting eye." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Her father uttered a groan of anguish, staggering as though his very frame had been dealt a blow. "You contrived the disappearance," Holmes continued relentlessly, "not for greed, but for love. Graves," here he turned his gaze upon the rival suitor, "was ruined by debt. To save him from disgrace, you staged the impossible theft. You enlisted Duval's assistance, weaving illusion upon illusion, until even the keenest eye might falter. But fate turned cruel. The guard discovered your secret, and in that moment you chose silence over confession. His life was the price." A sob broke from the girl's lips. She rose unsteadily, her eyes wild with despair. "Yes," she cried, "it is true. I could not let him be ruined. I thought, if the diamond were gone, then the marriage would end, the debt forgiven, and Henry would be spared. But when Thomas, the guard, saw the truth, I had no choice." Her voice dissolved into tears. Her father stood stricken, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent grief. Holmes remained unmoved, his figure stark against the gloom. "The truth, Miss Harcourt, is not a curse upon a diamond, but the curse of human folly and desire. And tonight, it has claimed both honour and life." The chamber was silent save for the girl's muffled sobs. Her father stood rigid, his hands trembling upon the back of a chair, while the others watched Holmes with eyes wide, as though awaiting the verdict of a judge. Holmes's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of inevitability. Thomas, the unfortunate guard, was not slain at random. He was the one honest soul who pierced through your illusion, Miss Harcourt. He observed the comings and goings too closely, noted that the velvet case was handled strangely, and in his loyalty, he prepared to speak. That sealed his fate. He moved slowly across the chamber as he spoke, his words heavy with authority. You feared discovery, not only of the false theft, but of the part played by Mr. Graves, the man you sought to protect. Exposure would have meant disgrace for him, dishonor for you, and ruin for your family. The guard's silence was the price demanded by your deception. Eleanor let out a low moan, covering her face. Graves, pale and rigid, reached toward her, but Holmes's sharp glance cut him down. I do not claim you struck the fatal blow yourself, Holmes continued, but you knew it must be struck, and you did nothing to prevent it. The ace of spades, pinned upon his chest, was not a curse, nor the flourish of some theatrical hand. It was the mark of a player in a game where life itself was wagered. I confess a chill ran through me as I listened. The thought of a life cast aside so that illusion might endure seemed more monstrous than theft itself. And yet, there was tragedy too, for the girl's tearful figure spoke not of malice, but of desperation born of misplaced love. Holmes's gaze softened, though only for an instant. The guard died because he saw too much truth. It is a lesson, Watson, that men often pay more dearly for honesty than for lies. Holmes returned to the table, where the velvet case lay, the same case we had seen on that fog-drenched night in Baker Street, when this strange adventure first began. He placed it before us with deliberate care, and in the stillness, I could hear the quickening breath of every soul in the room. You told us the diamond was gone, he said softly. You showed us this case as proof of its absence. Yet the truth, my friends, is that the greatest illusion is always that which hides in plain sight. With a deft hand, he pressed along the seam of the case, his fingers searching with uncanny precision. A faint click sounded, scarcely audible, and then, before our eyes, a hidden panel slid free. From within, nestled in secret, blazed the Las Vegas diamond. Its cold fire leapt into the lamplight, casting a brilliance that filled the chamber with spectral radiance. A collective gasp rose from the company. Harcourt staggered back as though struck. Redmond muttered a hoarse curse. Duval's smile vanished in an instant, replaced by awe. Graves' eyes closed, as though in surrender, and the daughter collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. The theft, Holmes declared, holding the jewel aloft, was no theft at all, but a deception wrought with cunning and desperation. The diamond never left this case. Its disappearance was staged, its curse a tale to mask human greed and folly. And thus, the mystery is solved. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the storm's rumble beyond the windows. To me, the moment felt almost unearthly, as though we had glimpsed not merely the unravelling of a crime, but the revelation of some deeper truth about the shadows that dwell within the human heart. Holmes replaced the diamond with quiet finality, closing the case as though sealing a tomb. His voice, when it came, was grave. Diamonds dazzle the eye, Watson, but it is the illusions we weave around them that break men's lives. The dreadful work of justice began at once. Eleanor Harcourt, pale as marble and broken in spirit, was led away in chains. Her sobs echoed down the corridor like the dirge of a lost soul, and the sound struck me with such pity that for a moment I could scarcely believe she was guilty of so dark a deed. Her father staggered forward, as though he might shield her still, but the officers restrained him gently. He sank into a chair, his great frame bowed, his face hidden in his hands. Here was a man who had conquered the desert, who had built his empire from dust and stone, yet was undone in a single night, not by rivals or ruin, but by the betrayal of the child he loved above all earthly treasures. Holmes stood apart, his features carved into cold composure. He neither mocked nor pitied, yet his silence carried its own weight. For me, the sight was unbearable. A father's fortune intact, his reputation untarnished, and yet his heart shattered beyond all repair. The chamber seemed darker for it, though the storm had passed. A fortune might endure, jewels might survive, but love and trust, once broken, leave wounds that wealth cannot salve. Our business in Las Vegas ended with solemnity. When at last Holmes and I departed, the city's myriad lights blazed as fiercely as ever, casting the desert night in hues of gold and crimson. Yet to my eyes, they were stripped of splendor, for every flicker reminded me of the cruel illusions that had cloaked crime and sorrow. From the carriage window, I watched gamblers hurrying through the crowded streets, their faces flushed with desperate hope. Music rose from the taverns, laughter from passing throngs. But beneath it all I thought I heard the hollow echo of Eleanor's sobs and the thud of a body bearing the ace of spades upon its chest. Holmes remained silent beside me, his long fingers pressed together, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I longed to speak, to draw from him some word that might ease the heaviness of my heart, yet his composure forbade interruption. He seemed less a man than a vessel of iron logic, unbending, unswayed, while I, poor mortal that I am, could not shake the images of grief and blood that clung to me still. Thus we left the desert, its brilliance dimmed by shadows that would linger long after our return. It was with no small relief that I found myself once more within the familiar walls of Baker Street. The fog of London curled against the window panes, muffling the clamour of the city, and the crackle of our hearth offered a comfort that the desert's lights had denied me. As I sat by the fire, pen in hand, I strove to put into words the dreadful tale we had endured. The warmth of the room, the smell of tobacco, and the sight of Holmes in his accustomed chair should have soothed me. Yet my thoughts wandered still to Harcourt's bowed figure and his daughter's broken cry. Holmes, perceiving my disquiet, at last spoke. "You are troubled, Watson." "How can I not be?" I exclaimed. "A young woman driven to deception, a father left desolate, a loyal servant struck down, all for the sake of a stone." Holmes leaned back, his gaze fixed upon the flames. "Not for the sake of the stone, my dear fellow. Diamonds are but hardened illusions. They dazzle the eye, but it is the human heart that breaks upon them. What we have witnessed is not the curse of a jewel, but the curse of desire." His words fell like iron upon my spirit. The firelight danced across the room, casting fleeting shapes upon the walls, and in its glow I thought of the empty velvet case that had so beguiled us all. As the flames in our hearth burned low, I found myself unable to shake the images of the Harcourt tragedy. The vast halls of their desert palace rose before me again in memory, each echoing with grief, each corner tainted by betrayal. I turned to Holmes, who sat in his chair, smoke from his pipe wreathing his features in spectral haze. "It is a cruel business," I said at last, my voice low. "A young woman driven by love to crime, a father broken by betrayal, and a faithful servant cut down for no more than honesty. And all for a jewel. Can there be any lesson but the sheer inhumanity of greed?" Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke, his gaze fixed upon the fire. "Greed, yes, but greed is but one face of the hunger that plagues mankind. Wealth, power, love, even honour, men pursue them with the same blind fervour. And when their desires collide with reason, destruction follows as surely as night follows day." He leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching his sharp profile. "You see, Watson, the diamond itself was no more than a vessel, a fragment of hardened carbon, dazzling only because men choose to worship its brilliance. Its worth was not in its substance, but in the illusions men built around it, illusions of salvation, of deliverance, of triumph. When such illusions shatter, it is not the stone that cuts, but the heart that breaks upon them." His words struck me with a weight I could not dismiss. For all his detachment, Holmes spoke with a gravity that revealed a rare glimpse of the man beneath the reasoning machine. And as I looked into the fire, I felt not merely sorrow for the Harcourts, but unease at the thought that every man, in his way, is tempted by some diamond of illusion. For some moments, Holmes said no more. Then, As though compelled by some private thought, he rose from his chair and crossed to the mantelpiece. There, resting among his scattered papers, lay the velvet case. The very case that had begun our adventure, its secret now laid bare, its treasure restored to Harcourt's keeping. Holmes lifted it gently, as though it were some relic of the past, and opened it. The hollow within yawned empty, its compartment bare, its mystery exhausted. Yet in the stark vacancy of that little box, I felt a presence as chilling as the night air beyond our windows. Holmes gazed into the emptiness, his expression unreadable. At length he murmured, half to himself, half to me. And yet, Watson, was it the stone that cursed them, or their own desires? The words lingered in the room like a spectre. The fire crackled, the fog pressed against the window, and I sat in silence, unable to reply. For though I am a man of science and medicine, I could not deny the truth of his question. The diamond was gone, yet its shadow remained, etched not in glass or stone, but in the fragile hearts of those who sought it. So ended the case of the Las Vegas diamond. But even as I closed my notes, I knew that neither Holmes nor I would soon forget the illusions it had cast, nor the price paid by those who mistook its brilliance for salvation. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the empty velvet case resting upon the mantel. His gaze lingered on the hearth before he spoke, his tone calm, almost meditative. Watson, men are quick to blame stones, jewels, or fate itself for their ruin. But the truth is simpler. It is not the diamond that destroys, it is the desire men weave around it. A curse, if such a thing exists, lies only in the human heart. And now I turn to you. What do you think was Eleanor Harcourt's greatest mistake? Her crime, or the illusion she chose to believe? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this mystery, do subscribe for more tales of deduction and intrigue. And of course, pass this story on to friends who delight in the shadowed brilliance of Sherlock Holmes.